Maybe learn how to speak properly before trying to join the conversation. The words cut through the executive lounge at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, drawing a ripple of laughter from nearby travelers. For a moment, even the soft piano music drifting from hidden speakers seemed to disappear beneath the sound. Maya Brooks slowly lowered her paper coffee cup and turned her head. The polished marble floor reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through the massive windows overlooking the runway. Beyond the glass, a line of aircraft waited beneath a sky slowly darkening with approaching storm clouds. Maya's expression never changed. She simply looked at the man who had spoken. Richard Sterling sat comfortably in a leather chair, one ankle resting across his knee, surrounded by several executives dressed in tailored suits. Everything about him projected confidence. The expensive watch, the private aviation magazine folded on the table beside him, the loud certainty that everyone around him should pay attention whenever he opened his mouth. Richard smiled as though he had delivered the cleverest joke in the room. A few people chuckled again. Others avoided eye contact. Maya could feel the familiar weight of judgment hanging in the air. Not because of what she wore, not because she looked out of place, but because of her voice. A voice shaped by years growing up in rural Georgia. A voice that carried traces of family dinners, church gatherings, and long summer evenings on front porches. A voice some people heard and immediately underestimated. Maya looked at Richard for one quiet second longer. Then she smiled politely. "Have a good afternoon, sir." That was all. No argument, no anger, no attempt to prove anything. She picked up her laptop bag and walked toward the far side of the lounge. The laughter faded behind her. Richard shook his head and returned to his conversation. "Some people just don't belong in rooms like this," he said casually. His colleagues nodded along. None of them noticed the airport employee near the coffee station watching Maya leave with an expression of recognition. None of them noticed another employee greeting her with a respectful nod as she passed. And none of them noticed Maya's phone lighting up with a series of messages marked urgent. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the horizon. The departure boards suddenly flashed yellow. Delays began appearing beside flight numbers one after another. Travelers checked their phones. Flight attendants hurried through terminals. The storm was moving faster than expected. Maya found a quiet seat beside the window overlooking Concourse F. She opened her laptop. The screen illuminated her face with a cool blue glow. Several confidential documents appeared immediately. Charts, financial reports, compliance reviews, risk assessments. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages. A notification appeared in the corner of the screen. Meeting moved forward. Final approval required today. Maya read it twice. Then she glanced toward the runway where lightning flickered beyond distant clouds. Back in the executive lounge, Richard Sterling was laughing again, proudly telling anyone who would listen about the billion-dollar aviation deal he expected to finalize before sunset. He believed every signature was already secured. He believed every obstacle had been removed. What Richard Sterling didn't know was that the woman he mocked less than 15 minutes earlier was carrying the one approval his company still desperately needed. And before the day was over, both of their flights would land in Chicago. The storm reached Chicago before either of them did. Rain streaked across the windows of O'Hare International Airport as passengers hurried through crowded terminals pulling rolling suitcases across polished floors. Maya Brooks stepped off her flight carrying only a laptop bag and a small leather portfolio. She moved with calm purpose, never rushing, never drawing attention to herself. Yet as she crossed the terminal, her phone continued vibrating with incoming messages. The final review committee had already arrived. Legal teams were waiting. Financial analysts were waiting. Executives from 3 different corporations were waiting. Everyone understood the importance of what was scheduled to happen that afternoon. Everyone except the man who believed the outcome was already guaranteed. Across the airport, Richard Sterling exited a private transportation shuttle, wearing the same confident smile he had carried all morning. The delay in Atlanta had frustrated him, but not enough to damage his mood. In his mind, the deal was finished. The meeting was merely a celebration before signatures became official. As he entered the downtown Chicago Conference Center, several members of his team greeted him immediately. One vice president handed him a tablet displaying the latest presentation. Another informed him that representatives from the investment board had already arrived. Richard barely listened. He was too busy discussing expansion plans. New aircraft, new routes, new markets, new profits. Everything felt inevitable. Meanwhile, Maya entered through a separate entrance on the opposite side of the building. A security officer opened a private elevator for her without hesitation. She thanked him and stepped inside. The doors closed softly. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the elevator rising toward the executive floors. Maya glanced down at the file resting inside her portfolio. Several pages were marked with yellow tabs. Safety compliance concerns. Maintenance reporting discrepancies. Financial disclosures requiring clarification. Issues that had not received enough attention. Issues that most people considered minor. Maya knew better. Details mattered. Small decisions created large consequences. The elevator opened onto the 32nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan, where gray clouds reflected across dark water. Inside the boardroom, a dozen professionals sat around a long polished table reviewing documents. Conversations immediately softened when Maya entered. Several people stood to greet her. Others nodded respectfully. She took her seat near the center of the room and opened her folder. No dramatic entrance. No speech. Just quiet preparation. Back downstairs, Richard stepped into another elevator surrounded by advisors and attorneys. One of them mentioned that final approval still required confirmation from the board chair. Richard waved away the concern. He assumed it was a formality. After all, nobody would reject a deal this valuable. Nobody would walk away from numbers this large. The elevator climbed higher. Minutes later, both elevators arrived on the same floor. One carried certainty. The other carried authority. Neither Richard nor his team realized they were only moments away from discovering that the quiet woman from the airport was connected to every decision that still mattered. And somewhere inside Maya's folder rested a single report that could change the future of the entire agreement. Richard Sterling entered the boardroom still carrying the energy of a man who believed he had already won. The polished oak doors closed behind him with a soft click. Around the long conference table sat attorneys, analysts, investors, and executives representing companies from across the country. The room smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and expensive leather. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline stood beneath heavy clouds gathering over Lake Michigan. Richard adjusted his jacket and greeted several people by name. His team followed closely behind him, placing tablets, folders, and presentation materials at their assigned seats. Everything appeared perfectly on schedule. Everything appeared under control. Then Richard noticed something unusual. Several senior board members were standing. Not casually. Not while preparing documents. They were standing as if waiting for someone important to arrive. He glanced toward the head of the table. The chair remained empty. One of his attorneys leaned closer. The board chair has not arrived yet. Richard nodded confidently. Whoever it was, the approval would be routine. A deal of this size benefited everyone involved. There was no reason for concern. Across the room, a side door opened quietly. Conversations stopped almost immediately. Chairs shifted. Several people straightened their posture. The room changed in a way that was difficult to explain but impossible to miss. Richard turned toward the doorway. His expression froze. Maya Brooks stepped inside carrying the same leather portfolio she had taken through the airport hours earlier. The same woman who had calmly walked away from ridicule without saying a word. The same woman whose accent had become the subject of jokes in the executive lounge. For a brief second, Richard wondered whether he was imagining things. Then reality settled in. One board member stood and greeted her warmly. Another thanked her for traveling despite the weather delays. A third handed her a folder marked Final Approval Review. Maya smiled politely and exchanged a few quiet words before taking her seat. Not near the back. Not beside an assistant. At the head of the table. Directly beneath the company seal displayed on the wall. Richard felt confusion ripple through his thoughts. He looked toward his legal team. Nobody seemed eager to meet his eyes. One attorney slowly opened a document and slid it toward him. Richard scanned the page. At the top appeared a name he had never bothered to learn before. Maya Brooks, chairwoman, Global Strategic Investment Board, Final Approval Authority. Richard's stomach tightened. Around him, the meeting officially began. Maya reviewed the agenda with calm professionalism. Her voice carried clearly through the room. The same voice that had been mocked earlier now commanded the complete attention of every executive present. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. Every person listened carefully. Maya moved through financial projections, compliance reports, operational forecasts, and safety evaluations. Richard tried to focus, but his mind kept returning to Atlanta, to the lounge, to the laughter, to the confidence he had displayed in front of strangers. Then Maya opened her portfolio and removed a yellow-tabbed report. The movement seemed small, almost insignificant, yet several board members immediately exchanged concerned looks. Maya studied the document silently for several seconds. The room became so quiet that Richard could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Then Maya looked up. Her expression remained calm, professional, controlled. But something in her eyes told everyone at the table that the meeting was no longer proceeding according to plan. Richard Sterling felt the confidence drain from the room one quiet second at a time. Maya rested the yellow-tabbed report on the table and folded her hands beside it. No one spoke. The city skyline shimmered through the rain beyond the glass walls. But inside the boardroom everything felt still. One investor adjusted his glasses. Another leaned forward slightly. Even the attorneys stopped typing. Maya glanced down at the document before speaking. Before we proceed to final approval, there is one issue that requires clarification. Her tone remained calm and measured, professional, the same steady voice that had carried through the airport lounge earlier that day. Richard swallowed and shifted in his chair. He told himself this was routine. Every major deal involved questions. Every review included additional discussion. Yet the expressions around the table suggested otherwise. Maya opened the report. Several pages contained highlighted sections, notes, and references attached to supporting documentation. Over the last 6 weeks, she said, our board requested updated maintenance compliance records from Sterling Aviation regarding several fleet modernization projects. Richard immediately nodded. Those reports were submitted. Maya looked toward him. Yes, they were. Her answer sounded neutral, but something underneath it caused uneasiness to spread through the room. Maya turned another page. The concern is not whether reports were submitted. The concern is whether the information provided accurately reflected operational findings. Silence followed. One of Richard's attorneys opened a folder and began scanning documents. Another executive shifted uncomfortably. Maya continued. 3 independent reviewers identified discrepancies between internal maintenance assessments and external disclosures. A large monitor mounted on the wall illuminated behind her. Charts appeared. Dates, inspection records, audit summaries. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts. Yet each new slide seemed heavier than the last. Richard felt heat rising in his neck. He leaned toward his legal advisor and whispered a question. The attorney did not answer immediately. Instead, he kept reading. Maya allowed several seconds to pass before speaking again. To be clear, no determination has been made regarding intent. However, the board cannot finalize funding while unresolved safety reporting concerns remain active. A board member near the end of the table nodded slowly. Another scribbled notes. Richard looked around the room. The meeting no longer felt like a celebration. Felt like an examination. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Maya remained composed. She was not attacking anyone. She was not raising her voice. She was simply following the responsibility entrusted to her position. That calm professionalism somehow made the situation even more serious. Richard finally spoke. These concerns can be addressed after approval. Delaying the agreement creates unnecessary complications. Maya met his eyes. The room seemed to shrink. Respectfully, Mr. Sterling, that is precisely why the review process exists. No anger, no revenge, just principle. The distinction was impossible to ignore. Richard remembered the airport again. The laughter, the assumptions, the certainty that he understood exactly who she was. Now every memory felt different. One investor quietly closed his folder. Another exchanged concerned glances with a colleague. Maya looked down at the final page of the report. Her fingers rested lightly on the document. Then she reached for a second folder that had remained unopened beside her since the meeting began. Several board members immediately straightened in their seats. Whatever was inside appeared far more significant than the report they had just discussed. And for the first time all afternoon, Richard felt genuine concern about what might happen next. The second folder looked ordinary. A simple dark blue cover. No labels visible from across the room. Yet the moment Maya placed it on the table, several members of the investment board exchanged glances that Richard could not ignore. The atmosphere shifted again. He felt it immediately. The confidence he had carried into the building was beginning to feel fragile. Maya opened the folder carefully. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed unusually loud inside the silent room. Outside, rain continued tracing slow lines down the windows overlooking Chicago. Inside, nobody reached for coffee. Nobody checked a phone. Every eye remained fixed on the documents in front of Maya. She reviewed several pages before speaking. 3 days ago, our board requested additional verification from an independent aviation consulting firm. Richard frowned. He had not been informed of any new review. One of his attorneys quickly began scrolling through emails on a tablet. Maya continued. The purpose was simple. We wanted to confirm that all operational disclosures matched field observations. A large display screen illuminated once again. New charts appeared. New timelines. New inspection summaries. Richard stared at the data. At first glance, nothing appeared catastrophic. No dramatic scandal. No shocking headline. Just a growing pattern of unanswered questions. Deferred inspections. Maintenance recommendations awaiting completion. Internal concerns classified as low priority despite repeated mentions. The kind of details executives often viewed as administrative inconveniences. Maya viewed them differently. So did the board. The issue is not a single event, Maya explained. The issue is a pattern. Her voice remained calm, professional, unshaken. When small concerns repeat across multiple reports, responsible oversight requires further investigation before approval. Richard leaned forward. Our company has operated successfully for years. Maya nodded. Yes, and that success makes accuracy even more important. The response landed harder than any accusation could have. Several investors quietly reviewed the documents now displayed on their screens. One board member highlighted multiple sections. Another requested copies of supporting reports. The deeper they looked, the more serious the discussion became. Richard suddenly realized this meeting was no longer about growth projections or profit forecasts. It was about trust. The foundation beneath every signature sitting on that table. A senior board member adjusted his glasses and spoke for the first time. Were these findings disclosed during previous negotiations? The question hung in the air. Richard looked toward his legal team. No one answered immediately. Maya did not interrupt. She simply waited, calm, patient, allowing facts to speak for themselves. The silence stretched longer than anyone wanted. Finally, one attorney cleared his throat. Not in this level of detail. Several people lowered their eyes toward their notes. Maya closed the folder gently. Then she folded her hands together. Her expression showed no satisfaction, no personal victory, only responsibility. Richard remembered the airport lounge again. He remembered dismissing her without knowing her name. He remembered believing that authority looked a certain way and sounded a certain way. Now he sat across from the person holding the future of his largest business opportunity. Maya looked around the table before delivering the statement everyone had been waiting for. Based on the information currently available, I cannot recommend final approval today. The room fell completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed distant. Then Maya reached for a single sheet of paper resting beneath the folder. And the moment Richard saw the words printed across the top, he understood that the decision about the billion-dollar agreement had already been made. For several seconds, nobody moved. The sheet of paper resting in Maya's hand seemed to carry more weight than every presentation, projection, and forecast discussed throughout the day. Richard stared at the document from across the table. The bold heading at the top was impossible to miss. Funding authorization status. Beneath it sat a single line highlighted in yellow. Pending suspension review. The words landed like cold rain. Around the room, executives lowered their eyes to the copies appearing on their tablets. A few exchanged quiet looks. Others leaned back in their chairs and folded their arms. The atmosphere had changed completely. The excitement that had filled the boardroom an hour earlier was gone. In its place stood uncertainty. Maya did not rush to speak. She simply set the paper down and allowed the room to absorb what it meant. Outside the windows, the storm over Chicago continued rolling across the skyline. Dark clouds drifted above Lake Michigan. Rain traced silver paths down the glass. The city looked distant now, almost muted. One board member finally broke the silence. If approval is suspended, what happens next? Maya turned toward him. An independent review will be conducted. All findings will be evaluated. If concerns are resolved, the proposal can return for consideration. Her answer was calm and straightforward. No drama, no threats, just process, just responsibility. Richard sat motionless. He had spent months preparing for this agreement. Hundreds of employees expected it to move forward. Investors expected it. Partners expected it. Yet now the outcome rested on facts he had never considered important enough to examine personally. He looked down at the reports spread across the table. Small issues, deferred decisions, administrative concerns, details. The very details he had dismissed again and again. Maya understood something he had overlooked. Trust was built from details. Remove enough of them, and even the largest structure begins to weaken. The room remained quiet. Then Maya slowly closed the folder. The sound echoed softly through the boardroom. Richard found himself watching her. Not as an obstacle, not as an opponent, but as someone carrying a responsibility larger than personal feelings. He remembered the airport lounge once more. He remembered how easy it had been to judge her in a matter of seconds. How quickly he had assumed he knew her story, her education, her experience, her worth. The memory now felt embarrassing. Maya glanced toward the windows for a brief moment. The fading afternoon light reflected across the glass and illuminated the edge of the table. Her expression remained composed, but there was something thoughtful in her eyes, almost reflective, as though she understood exactly how difficult this decision would be for everyone involved. She was not celebrating. She was not enjoying the moment. She was simply doing what she believed was right. One investor quietly closed his laptop. Another gathered his notes. The meeting was nearing its end. Yet nobody stood. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The silence carried a strange weight now. Not anger. Not defeat. Reflection. Richard lowered his gaze toward the suspended authorization notice one final time. Then he looked back at Maya. For the first time all day, he realized the biggest mistake he had made was not hidden inside a report. It had happened hours earlier in an airport lounge. And somehow that realization felt heavier than the billion-dollar agreement now slipping beyond his reach. The meeting officially adjourned 20 minutes later, but very few people left immediately. Small groups remained scattered throughout the boardroom, speaking in lowered voices while assistants collected folders and powered down presentation screens. The storm outside had begun to weaken. Pale afternoon light filtered through the clouds and spread across the glass walls overlooking the city. Richard Sterling remained seated long after most executives stood. The empty chair beside him seemed strangely noticeable now. The untouched coffee near his folder had gone cold. Across the room, Maya gathered her documents with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the entire day. There was no sign of triumph in her expression. No satisfaction. No celebration. She simply organized her papers, thanked several board members, and prepared to leave. Richard watched quietly. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Hours earlier he had viewed her as someone unimportant. Now he was watching one of the most respected decision-makers in the room walk away from a billion-dollar opportunity because she believed accountability mattered more than convenience. One by one, the remaining executives departed. Eventually, only a handful of people remained. Richard stood slowly and crossed the room. For a moment he hesitated. He was a man accustomed to speaking with confidence. Negotiating came naturally to him. Persuasion came naturally to him. Yet finding the right words now felt surprisingly difficult. Maya looked up as he approached. Neither spoke immediately. Beyond the windows, sunlight finally broke through the retreating clouds and reflected off distant skyscrapers. Richard took a breath. "I owe you an apology." Maya listened without interrupting. "Not because of the contract," he continued. "Because of what happened before any of us arrived here." His voice was quieter than usual, more honest. "I made assumptions about you. I judged you before I knew anything about you." Maya studied him for a moment. The boardroom had become almost completely silent. The cleaning crew had not yet arrived. The city below continued moving as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Richard shook his head slightly. "The worst part is that I did not even realize I was doing it." Maya closed her portfolio. "Most people do not realize it." There was no anger in her response. No accusation. Just truth. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. "When you spoke today, everyone listened." Maya smiled faintly. "Today they listened because of my title." She paused. "The real question is why they did not listen before they knew it." The words lingered between them. Richard found himself unable to answer. Because she was right. Hours earlier, the same voice had carried the same intelligence, the same experience, and the same character. The only thing that changed was what people believed about the person speaking. Maya glanced toward the windows. Golden light now stretched across the boardroom table. "This was never personal, Mr. Sterling." Richard looked at her. "I know. The review would have happened regardless of who sat in that chair." She nodded toward the head of the table. "My responsibility is to protect the people depending on these decisions." Richard understood. For the first time all day, he truly understood. The contract had not been suspended because someone wanted revenge. It had been suspended because leadership required difficult choices. Maya lifted her portfolio and prepared to leave. As she turned toward the doorway, Richard noticed something he had completely missed before. Real authority was not loud. It did not need to announce itself. It simply carried the courage to do what was right even when doing so came at a cost. And standing there beneath the fading Chicago sunlight, Richard realized that lesson would stay with him far longer than any contract ever could. The boardroom doors closed softly behind Maya as she stepped into the executive corridor. The building felt quieter now. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean beneath the fading light of early evening. Long golden reflections stretched across the polished floors. Employees moved through the hallways carrying briefcases and laptops, unaware that one of the largest business agreements of the year had just been suspended upstairs. Maya walked toward the elevator with her portfolio resting comfortably against her side. Her pace never changed. She felt no excitement, no victory, only the familiar calm that followed a difficult decision made for the right reasons. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Just as the doors opened, a voice called her name. She turned. Richard Sterling was approaching from the far end of the corridor. This time he was alone. No attorneys, no advisors, no executives surrounding him. Just a man carrying the weight of several difficult realizations. Maya waited. Richard stopped a few feet away. For a moment neither spoke. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them, The setting sun cast warm light across the Chicago skyline. The city seemed peaceful, almost still. Richard finally broke the silence. The review team contacted us already. Maya nodded slightly. That was quick. Richard gave a faint smile. Apparently they have been preparing longer than I realized. There was no bitterness in his voice now. Only honesty. Maya understood. Sometimes the hardest discoveries were not hidden inside reports. They were hidden inside assumptions people never questioned. Richard looked toward the windows before speaking again. When I started this company, I paid attention to every detail. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Every aircraft, every inspection, every customer complaint. He paused. Then the company grew. Layers appeared. Departments appeared. Reports became summaries. Summaries became presentations. Maya listened quietly. At some point, I started trusting outcomes more than processes. Richard shook his head. I stopped asking the questions I should have been asking. The elevator doors remained open behind Maya, waiting. Neither seemed in a hurry. The conversation had become about something larger than business. Maya glanced down at her portfolio. Growth creates pressure. Richard nodded. That is not an excuse. No, Maya agreed. But it is often the beginning. The corridor fell silent again. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang briefly before disappearing into the background noise of the building. Richard looked at Maya. Can the agreement still be saved? Maya considered the question carefully. The agreement was never the most important thing. Richard smiled sadly. That sounds like something I should have understood a long time ago. Maya returned the smile. The concerns can be addressed. The findings can be corrected. Trust can be rebuilt. She paused. But only if the goal is improvement, not approval. Richard absorbed the words. For the first time all day, hope appeared in his expression. Not hope for a signature. Not hope for a transaction. Hope for a second chance to do things correctly. The elevator chimed again. Maya stepped inside. Richard remained standing in the hallway. As the doors slowly began to close, he spoke one final time. Thank you for doing your job. Maya met his eyes. The warm evening light reflected across the elevator walls. Thank you for finally understanding it. The doors closed gently. Richard stood alone in the corridor, watching his reflection fade from the polished metal surface. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, he was not thinking about the contract that had been suspended. He was thinking about the work that needed to begin tomorrow. 3 months later, the same city looked different beneath the bright light of spring. Sunlight reflected across the Chicago River. Tour boats moved slowly between towers of glass and steel. The winter storms were gone. The long gray afternoons had been replaced by clear skies and warmer air. On the 32nd floor of the same building, another meeting was taking place. The boardroom felt familiar, yet the atmosphere had changed completely. New reports sat neatly organized on the table. Independent reviews had been completed. Recommendations had been implemented. Audits had been verified. Every concern raised during the previous review had been addressed with careful attention. This time there were no shortcuts, no assumptions, no requests to rush the process. Richard Sterling sat quietly reviewing the final documentation. The difference in him was noticeable. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions others might have ignored. He read details he once would have delegated. The months following the suspended agreement had not been easy. They had required time, accountability, and difficult conversations. Yet the company emerging from that process was stronger than the one that entered it. Across the table, Maya reviewed the updated findings. The same calm focus remained in her eyes. The same professionalism. The same commitment to responsibility over convenience. Nothing about her had changed because nothing needed to. The room waited while she completed the final review. Outside the windows, sunlight filled the boardroom with a warm golden glow. The city stretched toward the horizon beneath a cloudless sky. Finally, Maya closed the last folder. The simple motion drew everyone's attention. Several investors exchanged hopeful looks. Richard remained still. He had learned enough to know that outcomes should never be assumed. Maya looked around the table before speaking. The review committee has completed its evaluation. Silence settled across the room. All previously identified concerns have been addressed. Documentation has been verified. Compliance standards have been satisfied. A few smiles appeared around the table. Maya paused briefly. Then she nodded. The board approves the agreement. The room released a collective breath. Relief spread quietly through the gathering. Not celebration. Not triumph. Relief. The kind that comes from earning trust rather than expecting it. Richard smiled and lowered his eyes for a moment. When he looked back up, Maya was already gathering her documents. The meeting concluded smoothly. People shook hands. Conversations resumed. Yet the moment Richard remembered most happened several minutes later in the hallway outside the boardroom. He caught up to Maya near the elevators. Sunlight streamed through the windows behind her. The city reflected in the glass like a living painting. "I wanted to tell you something," Richard said. Maya waited. Richard smiled. "The first thing I did after that day in Atlanta was remove a phrase from our leadership training materials." Maya raised an eyebrow slightly. "What phrase?" Richard laughed softly. "Executive presence." Maya smiled. "And what replaced it?" Richard looked out toward the city. "Demonstrated competence." For the first time, both of them laughed. Not because the moment was funny, because it was true. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Maya stepped inside. Richard remained in the hallway. As the doors slowly closed, she offered one final piece of advice. Never underestimate someone because of how they sound. Richard nodded. "I will not." The doors closed gently. The reflection disappeared. Outside, sunlight flooded the city. Airplanes crossed the blue sky above Chicago. People hurried through streets below without knowing anything about the conversations that had happened inside the building. Yet somewhere over the horizon, another traveler was boarding another flight, carrying another story no one would bother to ask about. And perhaps that was the lesson that mattered most. Wisdom does not arrive wearing a title. Character does not announce itself. And competence has never depended on an accent.